Hey, is this thing on? What does it say? Oh, right. My name is Graham Robin. I'm fresh from my honeymoon. I'm privileged to resume broadcasting today, the lead on News 24, to you like clockwork yet again. In our top story today, investigative journalist Carl Cohen reveals that SARS has sent a staggering R3 million bill to a company linked to two of Deputy President Paul Mashatile's sons. These two lads, though, are not to be confused with Mashatile's son-in-law, who owns the family's Constantia Palace. Sure, what a dynasty this is turning out to be.
This latest story, when we say there's R3 million owed on VAT legally by Modipadi Nokaneng, we're saying that the entire tender, which went from zero in June of 2022 to being worth 90 million rand now, as of the 1st of November, we're saying that these were the same resources, the same people making the decisions. To get away from that, what they've done is they've resigned and been added as directors. There's been a real chopping and changing between all of these individuals.
Later in our trending topic, a case yet to be cracked. It's back to the drawing board for the SAPS in the Murray murders probe. And finally, we recall Mzansi's rich media ownership legacy with On This Day in South African History.
New episodes of The Lead air Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m.
If you'd like to advertise on this very podcast, get in touch with us at thelead@24.com. My name's Graham Robinheimer, this is The Lead, and this is the South African story. Moving to our top story today, once a registered South African company trades past R1 million, the general rule of thumb is that it's now legally required to pay VAT, value-added tax. But tell that to two of the Deputy President's sons, whose company they're linked to, Modipadi Nokaneng, now owes the taxman, the South African Revenue Services, a cool R3 million randelas. This today revealed by investigative journalist Carl Cohen, who's live with me now from our Randburg studios. Kyle, welcome back to The Lead. How are you doing?
Thank you, Graham. It's always a pleasure to be here, and we're doing well.
Fantastic. 3 million smackaroos. It's not a small SARS bill to pay off, now is it?
No, I think for any company of any size, a R3 million penalty would generally, impact your bottom line quite heavily. And in this case, the point that we make in the stories is that, as far as we're aware, the only income this company has is from public contracts. So it makes it all the more egregious. Whenever we publish these stories and people talk about them, quite a lot of the comments will be, where's SARS? What is SARS doing? And in this case, we have an example. SARS is busy behind the scenes, but quite often we just don't find out about it,
Right. Bring us back up to speed sort of with the major sort of 90 million rand tender. Obviously it's a lot more in terms of value than what it was initially advertised for, that these two brothers linked to the current Deputy President scored with the Gauteng government, specifically the Infrastructure Development Department, which in turn helps beef up the development of hospitals for the health department. What was this initial tender? What was it in the beginning, and how did it sort of get to the value that it is now that these two brothers managed to score?
So let's rewind to June of 2022. That's when the tender was actually awarded. So this type of tender is actually a panel contract. So there wouldn't be a value attached to it. So what would happen is, the department would go out to market and say, these are the services we need. And in this particular case, the services needed was the maintenance and installation and looking after fire suppression and fire alarm systems at public health buildings around Gauteng. We're talking about, I think it's 37 buildings around the province. And you are then appointed to a panel, and while you're on this panel, the department may make use of your services at any time on pre-agreed rates to go to any of these facilities to do any of the work. Now, I must just caveat this right from the very beginning. We know that the tender was for fire suppression and alarm systems, but very limited information available about what work they actually did for the department. Doesn't seem to be awfully related to that. Our sister publication, Netwerk24, actually revealed quite a while ago that one of the payments made to one of these two companies was for the supplying of a fax machine at a mortuary in Pretoria. Now, I don't know if anyone still actually uses fax machines. I know that we at Media24 certainly stopped using them, I think about 10 years ago. But, these are the sort of things we must look at. Now, These two companies are Ngwato and Manzi Group and Modipadi Nokaneng. Why we say these two companies are connected, and this is where it gets very legally technical and challenging. So I'm going to try and be as sort of clear as possible without getting us into trouble legally.
Thanks.
The Ngwato and Manzi Group is a company that was at one point or another run by two of Deputy President Paul Mashatile's sons, Tabiso Mashatile and Tanyiko Mvalasi. Same dad, different moms. Now, their business partner and friend, a guy called Nala Matlakuana, his company was Modipadi Nokaneng, was run by two sisters, Lefense and Tato Nokaneng. And this group of friends, for lack of a better word, they ran these two companies together. Now, on paper, when they were added to the tender panel back in June of 2022, these companies are technically competitors, right? But what we've managed to figure out through a bit of digging and talking to a couple of people who worked at the companies previously is that they were never separated. They were never separate companies. The tenders were put in separately, the bids were put in separately, but they shared office space, they shared staff. It went to the level of where one former worker was telling us that before they submitted invoices to the department, they would have to double check with one of the directors of the company which company's letterhead must be on the invoice, kind of thing. So that's why in our reporting we've linked these two companies together. That's why in this later story, when we say there's 3 million rand owed on VAT legally by Modipadi Nokaneng, we're saying that the entire tender, which went from zero in June of 2022 to being worth 90 million rand now as of the 1st of November, we're saying that these were the same resources, the same people making the decisions. To get away from that, what they've done is they've resigned and been added as directors. There's been a real chopping and changing between all of these individuals at various points in time of who's a director when and that, so that now when we approach them for comment, they say, well, I'm no longer director, so I can't really reasonably be expected to know what's happening here.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting little technical cop-out, but we've seen that this has kind of been a very similar modus operandi in other instances where allegedly dodgy tenders have been awarded, right, Carl?
No, definitely. And the way we circumvent this, and actually it's quite funny, we're talking about payments worth 90 million rand. And the reason why we went back to look at this tender again, why we took a step back to reinvestigate, cover our steps previously, is because in October of 2024, Modipadi Nokaneng and Ngwato and Manzi laid off workers. And there was an agreement through the commission, the CCMA, through a commissioner there. And they owe some of these workers that they laid off about 219,000 rand total. The amounts range from 16,000 to 30,000. It's basically a month's salary for some of these workers. They've owed the workers this money since October of 2024 and have not paid them to date. So when one of these workers approached us and said, listen, we see that you've been digging into this issue. We just wanted to let you know that we haven't been paid. And effectively, if you weigh up the scales here, and you look at 90 million rand came into these two companies, and they're now in a position where they can't even pay 200,000 rand in settlements to former workers. That leads us to deeper questions about their financial stability and their ability to actually have been in a position to execute on these tenders. Now, we know that while they may not be responsible for every single public health facility's fire alarm and fire suppression system, we do know, thanks to Jack Bloom of the DA, who is, a stalwart in Gauteng in terms of the health environment, that not a single one of the Gauteng public health facilities has, fire systems that meet health and safety standards.
Which brings me to that question, how much do we understand of the work that has been allegedly or not delivered in the case of this particular, which you've now sort of described as this later inflated tender value to the tune of 90 million rand? How much has been delivered and how much hasn't? Do we know?
It's very difficult. It's extremely difficult. I'll give you an example, Graham. When we initially reported about the workers being owed money, we fought with the Gauteng Department of Infrastructure Development, who was the implementing agent on behalf of the Department of Health. That's a whole different mess that I still do not understand why they did do it that way. But they came back to us after much fighting and toing and froing with a figure of 49 million rand. That's the total value of what that contract cost. It was only after Jack Bloom then went and got responses through the Gauteng Provincial Legislature from the MEC that we found out, no, the actual amount is 90 million. They still owe Modipadi Nokaneng 43 million rand. What for is a much more difficult question to answer. We know of select examples, where they were asked for the fax machine, for example. They were also asked to look after a water treatment plant at one hospital. But as far as the entire 90 million rand, I cannot now here sit and tell you that, 1 million was for this, 2 million was for that, 3 million was for that. We simply don't know. And getting answers out of the Gauteng provincial government, in keeping with our past experiences investigating, matters linked to or in the orbit of Paul Mashatile, it becomes extremely difficult to extract any information. And that inevitably leads you back to the idea that, look, Paul Mashatile is a Gauteng-born politician. He was a provincial baron of Gauteng ANC circles for so long that it starts to make sense when you start trying to pick away at these things. And I'm not saying it's easy to get information otherwise, but particularly when the name Paul Mashatile is in the mix anywhere, it becomes next to impossible to get information out.
Right. There's some bells ringing very similar to the Gauteng Forensic Medical Services Lab, of course, which our colleague Alex Patrick, Johannesburg Metro journalist, has been reporting on for the longest time. The delays there. She's also relayed to me in the past how, and I've experienced it myself in a previous story that I did in Joburg once upon a time, is that the infrastructure department, I think it was at the time that I did, it was led by MEC Tasneem Motara, and the health department. There's always this passing of the buck. Not either one of them wants to give a final sort of media answer or official statement when it comes to a lot of these big sort of infrastructure development projects. So that passing of the buck of the responsibility, just from that perspective of trying to get accountability from our leaders, is often the issue. And I don't know why it can't be more simple than that. What's the current status of the Public Protector's investigation into this deal, which has brought the Deputy President's sons into its orbit? What is the Public Protector specifically looking at here, Kyle? And do we know the status of the investigation thus far?
So we don't know the status of the investigation. We have had indications, over the past few months of requests for information going out from from the Public Protector's investigators in Gauteng, and responses being sent over. But unfortunately, we haven't had sight of the content of those responses, nor is the Public Protector normally up for discussing ongoing investigations at all. What they will be looking at here are probably some very narrow issues around, in terms of the procurement, was it all done legally? In terms of the payments, was it all administered properly? Is there proof that work was delivered, etc.? The Public Protector, it's all in the name. What they do is they try and protect the public from the abuses of government officials. In my past experience, however, what I have found is that the Public Protector's mandate can be sometimes quite narrow. So we mustn't, hang our coat on this hook and believe that we are going to get the full answers here. It will be a significant part of the picture, and the recommendations will be critical and important. Our job as, in terms of investigative reporting, is going to be then determining, once we see the report, once we see the final outcome, determining who lied, who misled the Public Protector, and who told the truth, and then the implementation of those recommendations. Our job is going to be to track that and try and push that forward. Unfortunately, and again, whenever very senior ANC people are in the mix, when their children are in the mix, we've seen this movie before as South Africans, it becomes extremely difficult for us to, for government departments, the police, to do the logical thing and take the next step in investigations or implementing recommendations. So that's going to be the next struggle. I don't foresee, the Public Protector investigation being the final word on any of this.
Sure. And just in the back of my mind, just as a side comment, hey, isn't it funny how South African sort of nepotism when it comes to the public space is such a historical pastime in this country? It's been like that for ever.
Yeah, and look, I mean, let's not pretend like South Africa's, the only corrupt place. And I think that this model, particularly of spouses, children, cousins, aunts, uncles, sort of moving along the side of a deal that a politician is, has oversight of and reaping some sort of benefit, either for themselves, for the family writ large, or for the politician, but just disguising that income so that they don't have to, deal with any of the allegations of corruption and nepotism, et cetera, et cetera. That is what makes investigative journalism particularly difficult because legally, the politician has not done anything wrong. Unless we can prove that they directly influenced the awarding of a contract to, most of the time, the area is a lot more gray. So in this case, Paul Mashatile will tell you, well, I had absolutely nothing to do with awarding of tenders in Gauteng, particularly through the Department of Infrastructure, etc. And he may be right. He may have had nothing to do with it. But that is where our argument is that that perception of influence always exists. And that is why it is very important, when you do public procurement, you have to declare whether you're a politically exposed person. And it is for that reason. And particularly in a case like this where we can't prove that performance on the contract has been exemplary, we have a right as the public then to ask questions and say, well, if a company that was directly being controlled by the deputy president's sons, in this case, in Ngwato and Manzi Group was paid, 17.9 million and is owed another 94,000 rand, which is, but 17 million rand is a lot of money. It's public money. We deserve to know, particularly when you consider the number of very convenient fires at Gauteng hospitals over the last couple of years. This is a very fraught area. The way that fire alarms systems weren't working at Charlotte Maxeke or at Tembisa Hospital, etc. This was closed. It was, and not that these companies worked on any of those systems directly, but this is a very fraught area. We know that there's massive corruption in the Gauteng health system centered around hospitals. We've seen Tembisa Hospital and the extraction that has happened there. And these fires are started to destroy records. Because remember, everything is paper-based and these records are stored there. That is why a job like this, looking after fire suppression systems and alarm systems at hospitals, is far more critically important than just saying, oh, the infrastructure needs to be protected. That's obvious. That's a given. But we need to take it a step further and say, in fact, in the bigger war against corruption, this tender was absolutely critical. It was such an important thing. Because as months go by, as time goes by now going into the future, we are going to be seeing a lot more of the underbelly of the Gauteng Health Department and corruption and spending there. And that's why this story is important. That's why even a whiff of political influence in this tender is so absolutely alarming.
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent point. Couldn't have said it any better myself. And yeah, it's just like ever since Life Esedimeni, the terrible tragedy that befallen, our health sector, it's just been one issue after another. And again, I'm just using that as the inflection point onwards because we have such a long history in this regard. Any answers from Tinyiko Mvalase as well as Tabiso Mashatile, the two sons, as you say, from two different mothers that were once wed to the deputy president? Any engagement from their part, willingness to sit down and have interviews with yourself, Kyle?
No. In fact, quite the opposite. We got quite a rude and funny legal letter from their attorney, who I assume I'd never dealt with this person before, despite having interacted with Mr. Tabiso Mashatile and Mr. Mvalase previously. And this new attorney threatened to sue News24, threatened to seek a costs order, which is it's a traditional sort of threat to try and get journalists to back off, because they threaten to cite you in your personal capacity, and then it's called a slap suit. We can get into that one day, and it's obviously I just laughed at him and said to him, look, your threats won't work. Answer the questions or don't. They have refused to answer the questions. Their stance is, look, because my clients being Mr. Matlakuana and Mr. Mashatile resigned as directors of these companies, they can't be expected to know what is happening with the companies. Now,
so
to be fair,
so convenient.
Yeah. Very convenient. Legally, they are quite correct. They have no longer any responsibility towards the company. Even when I try to point out to them, that workers are sitting hungry at home, having worked for you, and there was an agreement, and they are owed money, that didn't seem to shift the needle at all. And they have continuously adopted a stance. People in Mr. Mashatile's orbit have continuously adopted a stance to try and accuse News 24 of running some kind of, smear campaign, some sort of defamatory sort of orchestrated campaign against them. Now, our response to this has always been very simple. This is accountability. He is the deputy president. It doesn't really faze us that he accuses us of these things because it is simply not true, especially not when they can't show any real responses that have been provided to us in terms of facts and figures and timelines to counteract what we are reporting. So in this case, it's exactly the same. We've questioned them. And, in terms of their stance on this is that they acted, quote unquote, within their ethical and legal requirements as directors of the companies at all times. That may be so. But of course, we're not only questioning the legal and sort of ethical guidelines here, we're also questioning the morality of this contract and whether they deserve to get it. We can't answer those questions yet. We can't say for sure it was all awarded legally and everything was above board. We don't know if there was influence in the awarding process. But what we do know is that 90 million rand, half of that has already left public coffers, another 43 0.8 or 9 million is going to be leaving public coffers, and we deserve to be able to question that. And unfortunately, Graham, we don't have any sort of interaction with them on the other side to, take us into their side of the story and explain to us what services they delivered when and where, despite the opportunity being given to them.
Well, you remember the furore around, obviously, the mansions that the Deputy President had declared to parliamentarians. And then did you see that SABC interview? I kind of wanted to ask you about it at the time if you did see the response out in the field. One SABC journalist had asked the Deputy President, what's your take on these mansions that you've declared to Parliament? Obviously, one in Waterval and the other one in Constantia in Cape Town, very plush places that... according to the Deputy President, is owned by son-in-law. And then the Deputy President's response is, well, what's the problem? So I think that's our only a real official response here throughout most of this.
So he actually said something more interesting than that. What he also then added is, people must learn how to read. I never declared this house as my own, particularly the Constantia property. And his words were, people must just learn to read. Those were his exact words. Because he claims that the declaration that he provided to Parliament, he declared that house as a family-owned property. Now, I know that's unlikely because the declaration process does ask you to declare sort of immediate family members, assets, etc. But there are very clear delineations. So, but of course, when we filed a Promotion of Access to Information Act request to Parliament for those original declarations so that we can either prove or disprove what he is saying to the public, Parliament refused to give us that information.
So read properly is kind of like listen properly. Remember who said that?
One Jacob Zuma. Yes.
Kyle, thanks so much, bro. I really appreciate your time on this story. We're going to do a quick segue and then we're going to have you back in the next short while with an update on our training topic. But in the meantime, if you want to read Kyle's latest piece that emerged on the front page of News 24 over the weekend, 3 million rand tax bill, SARS guns for company linked to Mashatile kids in hospital tender scandal.
You're listening to the latest edition of The Lead on News 24 with Graham Rowenheimer. If you've got an opinion on what you've heard so far, drop us a short voice note on our WhatsApp hotline. That's 072 562 3179. Trending topic.
Welcome back to The Lead. Moving to our training topic now. They were killed more than 2.5 years ago. And with News 24 picking up the investigation trail following the murders of top liquidators, the father and son duo, Klutter and Thomas Murray, on one of the country's busiest highways in full broad daylight, Gauteng police have now conceded to restarting their probe into this very curious case. To tell us why now, Kyle Cohen is still on the line with us. Kyle, the Murrays, they've consistently been promised sort of a high-profile, top-draw investigation by the SAPS, but it's really failed to materialize. There haven't really been any major breakthroughs in this case. Why?
Graham, that's such a difficult question to answer. I wish I could tell you why. I have spent a considerable amount of time over the past, almost 3 years just following this and keeping very close tabs on what's going on, particularly with the police investigation. And the reason for that is just very simple. The day after the murders, on the 19th of March 2023, I found my way into the police impound in Ayrton, just south of Johannesburg, where the vehicle had been stored after being taken away from the scene. And, there was evidence left behind in the car. And this was, Thomas had been declared dead at the scene, and Klute had died in hospital around 5 o'clock that morning. By 10:30 on that Sunday morning, I already found evidence that the police investigation was being sort of bungled, So for that reason, we sort of decided to keep an eye on this much closer than we normally would, because it's just, I hate to sound callous about this, but there are 25,000 murders. In 2023, there were just over 25,000 murders that year in this country alone. And, sometimes to just drill down and focus in on 2 murders out of that whole sea of pain and sort of criminality, it sometimes feel like we might be not doing a duty to our readers. But in focusing on this, what we are able to do is tell a wider story and view the police through a prism of one angle. So that's sort of what journalism tries to do, right? Focus on one angle to tell the bigger story. That's why we focused on this. But answering your question, why the police have done so poorly here, I think it's a combination of things. It's a combination of incompetence and lack of will, and then also quite a deal of infiltration by organized crime within the police. And we're seeing all of that playing out at the Matlanga Commission, but that's a whole different kind of corruption. What we're talking about here is just the slow walk. It's just the not doing things quickly, no urgency. I often, when people ask me about this, Graham, I tell them, you remember that there was that TV program, The First 48. It was like this true crime kind of documentary series. I think it may have been put out by CBS in America. And it's that rule around how the first 48 hours of any murder investigation is where the case is made. You can make it or break it in that first sort of 2 days. And what we see repeatedly, in particularly in high profile sort of murder investigations in South Africa, and I'm not just talking about the Mauricio, we're also talking about Babita Deokaran, we're talking about Senzo Mayiwa, we're talking about Mpho Mafole, Tracy Brown. There are just so many of these cases, and the police just don't have that urgency in that first 48 hours. And often when you talk to cops, they'll tell you, it's because I have 40 dockets sitting on my desk. I don't have time to run around. And, quite funny, if you flip that on its side, if you focused more in the first 48 hours on collecting the absolute critical evidence, you probably wouldn't have 40 dockets stinking up your desk. So there needs to be a complete change in the way that cases are assigned and handled within the police. And then maybe we can start having a conversation about individual police officers and whether they are competent enough to be murder investigators.
Yes, it's an excellent point. I would add to that, just from a devil's advocate point of view, that the incentivization of police officers is also a hot button issue, that they just don't get paid enough. One of the key suspects, though, in the Murray's murders has already been killed. How do we know this?
Yeah, so very early on in this investigation, obviously quite a lot of the stuff that I as an investigative journalist deal with on a daily basis, it's stuff that I may only publish a year from now or 6 months from now or 2 weeks from now. And in some cases you come across information that would be, you could potentially be placing yourself in a position where you are defeating the ends of justice or where you are obstructing a police investigation. So we have to be very careful in terms of what we publish and when. And very early on in the Murray investigation, because obviously I didn't just look at what the police were doing. We also ran our own investigation to try and figure out who would have done this and why. And I think, we came to our conclusions quite early on in terms of who were the ultimate people who planned this entire thing and who was driving the vehicle that day, for example. And through that work, what we've also managed to figure out is we picked up a number of names, 3 names of people who were potentially the people in the vehicle that day with the one person we've already identified. Now, the person we've already identified as a person of interest, Mr. Ryan Barwell, we identified him because he is not suspected of physically harming anyone. He is the person who drove the vehicle. We named him because the police had failed to interview this person. And despite us writing a story saying, the police had identified this person for several months and that it's still not interviewed him, to this day, as we sit and speak, Graham, they identified Mr. Barwell. I believe it was around the murders happened in March. I believe it was around April, towards the end of April, early May of 2023. They still have no police officer has ever interviewed this man to this day. Now, one of the names we picked up very early on as the potential gunman, the man who sat in the front passenger seat and physically aimed the 9mm, at the Murray's car and opened fire, was a gentleman named Burnett Hermanus. We know that the police have had this name and have been looking at him from very early on in the investigation. But, from a journalistic point of view, we made the decision that we can't name this person because it would then become very obvious that if we know who he is, that the cops are looking at him. Now, the counter argument to that is that, of course, this person would already know if the police were looking at him because he does have sort of connections within his own connections within the police, etc., which is part of the reason why he thought he could probably get away with something like this. But on the 1st of October, Mr. Hermanus drove his bright orange Isuzu double cab bakkie to the parking lot of Netcare Mill Park Hospital and parked it not in the normal parking where you and I would park, but actually parked it in the emergency parking, which is reserved for, sort of emergency room doctors who have to rush into the hospital and get to the emergency room or to theater very quickly. Reverse parked it right in front of the hospital entrance there and apparently was not accosted by the security, even though the same security wouldn't even let me anywhere near it. Yeah. But then went inside the hospital to visit a friend of his who had himself just survived an assassination attempt.
Jeez.
And as he was leaving the hospital and he greeted someone and then he walked to his car, and shortly after he got into the driver's seat of the car, shots were fired at the vehicle, at least 13 to 15 shots, and he was killed. That was on the 1st of October. Now, this is what happens, Graham, when the police simply take too long. When they twiddle their thumbs and they dilly-dally and they don't show urgency in an investigation, critical evidence will now be lost forever. The opportunity to interrogate Mr. Hermanus is gone forever. The opportunity to build out a picture based on his own lies and statements or information that he gives to the police is now gone. So now we are sitting in a position where there, as far as we know, there were 2 other people in the vehicle that day, the day that Clutter and Thomas Murray were shot. One of them is now deceased. And it doesn't, I must just add, it does not appear as if his shooting had anything to do with the Murray case. But now there were 2 other people in the vehicle that day. So you as the police, your opportunity to get a full picture of what actually happened that day, who was where and who was driving where, has now been cut down from 3 to 2. And still, despite that, we are now on the 3rd of November. It's more than a month after Mr. Hermanus was killed. We are not seeing that urgency again. We are not, again, you would expect that in a case like this where one of your suspects is killed and you still haven't interviewed anyone, you would expect someone within the South African Police Service to say, you know what, this is getting hot and heavy. We need to get in there and potentially protect our suspects / witnesses. Because remember, a person of interest is not necessarily a suspect in the case. And if the police are not protecting these people, if the police are not getting agreements in place to make sure that they have testimony or evidence, every day that goes by, you place your ability to solve a case more and more at risk, and you place individuals more and more at risk.
Carl, to end off, you could say that this is sort of, replicating itself within the Boa van Niekerk murder investigation. Sadly, as we've seen, no breakthroughs there yet. Ending off, what are the police now promising in regards to the Murray murders case? What's the latest promise there? Have they given themselves deadlines? And just quickly, the response to the family.
Yeah, so just to quickly go back, the case was originally handled by Gauteng Organized Crime Cops. That's now been taken away from them. It's now being handled by a team of detectives from the Serious and Violent Crimes Unit directly under Major General Mbuso Khumalo, who, by all accounts, is an extremely competent investigator and commander, and his team are all extremely competent. They have apologized to the family, and they have given the family an undertaking that the case will now be done properly. The family at this point are not too concerned with time. They are more concerned with forward progress. So we must respect that they are now trying to not only recover an investigation that has obviously been bungled, but they're also trying to solve the case. So at this point now, we will give this new team of investigators, I think, far more leeway, but not in terms of years. We're talking months. So the family have agreed to back off a little bit, give them a little bit of space, give them a little bit of time. No timelines have been agreed. No sort of clear deadlines have been set for anything. So at this point, the family are happy that the new investigation team appears far more competent. They're asking the right questions. The family members I've spoken to have said just the content and the tone of the questions being asked of them for certain types of information is already placing them in far more sort of comfortable, confident space in terms of, how this investigation is going to be handled further. That said, the hope and expectation is tempered. It is not, boundless. I think that the family have had a terrible experience with the South African Police Service, and they are not going to suddenly overnight believe that, sun shines out of places and people are going to get things done that need to get done. They're hopeful, but there is still a high degree of sort of reticence to allow that hope to grow into anything too big.
Right, Carl, just before we end off, here's an excerpt, a soundbite from our exclusive interview with Monet Murray, the widow of slain liquidator Thomas Murray. Let's have a listen.
It's very sad to think that after all this time, we are really back to square one. I don't think that you can really work on what was provided by the former team. They didn't take in witnesses. They omitted to collect evidence. Thinking about the fact that Thomas, who immensely loved his son, will never have the opportunity to take his son to school. Well, some of the suspects that have never been taken in for questioning have the privilege to take their children to school every single day. I don't think that's frustration. I think that's complete heartbreak.
Carl, thank you so much for joining us on The Lead today. I really do appreciate it. 2 massive stories. I don't know how you keep all your notes for all of these different investigations, but sterling work as always, and I can't wait to chat again.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Listen Up is News 24's sharp new podcast, where hosts Tim Cohen and Mark Barnes cut through the clutter with bold takes and unfiltered insight.
They're not fighting for the good of South Africa, and so this has degenerated into a series of tit-for-tat spats. How's that for a bit of poetry early in the morning?
Smart, punchy, and unapologetically real.
President Ramaphosa has explained why he did it, and the reason he did it was because he said that people weren't allowed to go to America, and then Andrew Whitfield did, and then there's a dispute about whether or not he asked.
Catch new episodes of Listen Up every Tuesday on News 24 or wherever you get your podcasts.
I know a lot about this. Not really.
Yeah, there we go.
Here goes.
The accused for a change. Go.
And finally,
Ending off with on this day in South African history, the 3rd of November, 1884. South Africa's very first black-owned newspaper, Imvo Zabansundu, meaning Opinion of the People, was published in King Williamstown. Today, the Eastern Cape Town is known as Qonce. Founded by Tanda Press and edited by politician and educationist Tengo Jabavu, it gave black South Africans an independent political voice. The paper even survived a banning order during the South African War before finally closing only in 1998. That's on this day in history, the 3rd of November 1884, courtesy of South African History Online Database. Anything on top of your mind that you perhaps picked up on today's show, something you'd like to share with us, a tip-off, anything, a voice note, you can get in touch with us at 072-562-3179. If you'd like to get in touch with us via the good old-fashioned way, the lead at 24.com works just as well. Hit follow, like, subscribe, all the usuals, you know the drill, on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels. We've noticed a lot of you tend to pick up on the show. You listen to it regularly, but perhaps you don't subscribe. We'd appreciate if you just click that little bell button. It'll help you let you know when future editions drop. We run just like clockwork, 7 p.m. Monday to Thursday. That's when the lead drops on the front page of News 24. And all of your favorite streaming platforms too, of course. Well, the week's just getting started, and I'm almost run out of breath. My name's Graham Robenheimer. So long as there's trusted news first, we'll always have the lead.